Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this, a thinking that I've been looking forward to more than I should admit. My brother-in-law, Ed, said to me a few weeks ago, you have to read this book, a book called The Meritocracy Trap. And perhaps every year there's a book that comes along that resets the thinking of the year. I'm sure that Thomas Piketty's book on capitalism did that a couple of years ago. Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism did this. And I have to tell you that this book, The Meritocracy Trap, has done that for me. It's one of those books that is unusually challenging and makes you rethink the way everything works. And so we're going to do something tonight, which I hope will encourage you to read it, but even if you don't, we'll reframe your thinking, which is get the chance to have a conversation with its author, Daniel Markovits. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It really is great that you're making time to be with us, so thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
So here's the way this works, Daniel, is a thinking. What we were trying to do with a thinking was take, if you like, the pattern of an editorial board meeting that you'd have in the States. You know, they'd invite you in, you might see the board of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, and you'd talk through your book. And in that process, you'd have people would give their points of view. Our thinking was, with a thinking, let's operate like an editorial meeting. Let's invite everyone in. And so what we hope is that in the course of the coming hour, everyone will weigh in with their thoughts, their reactions to what you say, how it impinges on their personal experience. And so, although this is slightly unusual because the ideas in the book really merit some talking through, and I'm going to invite you to talk them through at the beginning, I hope that in the course of the hour, we're going to get lots of people weighing in with their points of view, their personal experience. We have one rule at a Think-In, which is no questions. We want people to say their point of view, to give their experience. So we hope that people will throw those at you. People, I'm sure by now, know their way around a Zoom call, but just in case, it's a really simple thing. You know, do weigh in, you know, in the chat. We'll come to you where as soon as we can. My colleague, Pete Hoskin, is here. He's marshalling the conversation in the chat. And of course, also, do just stick your hand up. It should be a pretty easy thing to do by now. So please do exactly that. But Daniel, I was going to praise the book, and then I thought that's a foolish thing to do. You can do that far better than me. So why don't you start, if you would, by telling us what the fundamental argument of the meritocracy trap is.
Great, thank you for that. So basically the book is a full-on attack on meritocracy. And it may seem as though meritocracy is a kind of common sense. It's hard to object to the idea that people should get ahead based on their own accomplishments rather than, say, their parents' social class. And for a time, meritocracy worked as advertised. But what's happened, in fact, over the past 50 years or so, is that the elite that got ahead through meritocracy has acquired an almost boundless taste and enormous capacity for training its children. And so the rich now out-train their children compared to everyone else. And this produces a state of affairs in which meritocracy, getting ahead based on your own accomplishments, has become an obstacle to opportunity for almost everyone. It's created a new kind of aristocracy, only now based on university degrees rather than on breeding. And it's excluded most of society from real advantage. And at the same time, as we'll, I hope, get to at the end of the discussion, it also means that even those who get ahead end up having to exploit themselves in quite ruthless ways in order to extract wealth from their advantage. And so it leaves nobody well off. It excludes the rest and ensnares the rich, and is a system that's become bad for everyone.
It's so powerful, the argument, because at the heart of it, as you say, very right at the beginning of the book, you make this point that it excludes most people, and then it damages the few that it admits, i.e. the elites that profit from it, even in their lifestyle, are so damaged. But one of the things that I thought was really striking about it was not just the way in which, if you like, the successful train their children to be successful, but also the way in which work now works, the amount that you work and how that rewards you. Will you just talk a little bit through, if you like, the two forces, both education and labor, that form this meritocracy trap?
Sure. So one thing that's happened, as you say, is that the rich out-educate everyone else. They invest vast sums in educating their children in private schools in the UK and the US especially, actually, but increasingly elsewhere in the world. And that education is extremely stressful and demanding on the children who get it. It requires many, many hours of practice and training and constant testing and evaluation. Just to give you a sense, as recently as the mid-1990s in the United States, the University of Chicago admitted roughly 75% of its applicants. This year, the University of Chicago will admit 6% of its applicants. And that's a transformative competition for the elite. And it means that if you ever did anything wrong in your childhood, you won't get in. And that means that almost no middle or working class kid can get in, and only a few rich kids can get in. On the other hand, at work, you know, it used to be that you could tell how poor a person was by how long he worked. That the poor worked long hours and the rich constituted themselves self-consciously as a leisure class. Whereas today, you can tell how rich and how elaborately educated someone is by how long he works. Work has been transformed to focus on precisely the skills that elite education gives people, so that while most workers don't have enough to do, quite literally, and the economy doesn't produce enough good middle-class jobs, it also produces elite jobs, which require enormous numbers of hours. So lawyers, bankers, consultants, elite managers work 60, 70, 80, 90, sometimes even 100 hours a week for much of their careers in order to exploit the skills that they've acquired in school.
And can you just explain why? There was a stat, I think, relatively early into the book too, where you talk about law firms in 1962, I think it was, saying, look, you know, it would be reasonable to expect 1,300 billable hours a year. And by today, or in the last couple of years, that had risen to 2,400 billable hours. Is that just people in power hoarding income? Why has that change happened?
So it's happened for two kinds of reasons. One is a social and psychological reason, which is that as it has become the case that elaborate training and enormous productivity is the social signal of wealth and status and virtue, elites have sought to display their virtue in this way. And that's especially difficult to do without conspicuously working very hard. If you work in a way in which it's very difficult to discern individual contributions to the collective product. So for those of you, for example, who are rowers, you know, an eights boat is an averaging machine. Mm-hmm. And it's not so easy from the outside to figure out which of the rowers in the boat contributed the most. Whereas a single scull rowing, it's obvious who's contributed. What does this produce? It means that when the winners cross the finish line in singles rowing, they jump and dance in order to display that although they won, they still have something left. They still have some physical capacity left. And that's the way they show off, you know, not only did I win, but I could have rowed harder. At the end of an eights race, the rowers all slump. Why is that? Because since you can't figure out whose individual contribution was the most valuable, you have to show that you are totally spent. Similarly, in a law firm or a bank or a management consultancy, the way in which you signal how productive you are is by showing conspicuously how hard you've worked and exhausting yourself. And so there's that set of phenomena also. And the result is, as you say, that hours that would have been thought impossible, possibly, and certainly inhumane in 1960 are now completely routine in London, in New York, even in Paris, Berlin, Tokyo.
There's a lovely moment in the book where you call on Jeeves and Wooster, where you cite P.G. Wodehouse as a way of showing that for so many years the poor worked and the wealthy didn't work. In fact, the wealthy weren't exactly sure what work was, and now of course it's the wealthy that work and the poor that, in your phrase, are not idle but are being idled. Yeah. How much, Daniel, does technology play a part in this?
So I think technology plays a very big part in this, but not a freestanding or inevitable part. So the big part it plays is that the technologies of production that we use nowadays are ones that enable a very small elite of incredibly hardworking superordinate workers to be incredibly productive without using a lot of middle-class labor. And that's true in law, it's true in finance. If you think about finance as a good example, particularly because you're sitting in London, what securitization does is it makes it possible for banks to make loans without having to attend to the quality of the individual loan, because loan-specific risk is hedged out when the derivative is constructed. And what that means is that the loan officer, who was the middle-class worker who attested to and evaluated the quality of individual loans, is removed from the equation. And a super elite derivatives trader or securities developer can now manage a much larger portfolio of loans without middle-class labor.
So even in finance, a larger amount of money accrues to a smaller number
of people. So if you look at the data in the US, it's very striking. From 1940 to 1970 in the US, finance was a middle-class industry. Finance workers were not more elaborately educated than other workers, and they weren't better paid. Starting in around 1975, what happened was that finance's share of GDP kept going up and up and up, but its share of employment flatlined and started decreasing. And the education level and pay level of finance workers skyrocketed. So finance displaced middle-class workers with a relatively smaller number of relatively more elaborately educated, relatively more highly paid workers. And that's true for management, it's true for law, it's true for consulting, it's even true for manufacturing. One just last thought here. The US is in a manufacturing boom in the sense that manufacturing share of GDP has not fallen. And if you have a graduate degree, you have enormous opportunities in manufacturing. But middle-class, mid-skilled manufacturing employment has been destroyed.
So Daniel, just before we started, you bring some slides in, and I'd love you to talk through some of those, particularly as regards, the benefits in income and wealth and power. But before you do, I just have one thing I just want to ask you to clarify. I suppose when I started reading the book, I thought what the book was going to say was that meritocracy has been perverted by the rich, i.e. they're gaming the system. And the thing that I think is really devastating about the book is you're saying, no, this is the system. This is the system working. And can you just explain that it's not nepotism, that it's not people, if you like, doing deals to get their kids into schools. It's actually meritocracy at work.
Yeah, let me give you just two concrete illustrations of that, one from school and one from work. So in school, again, if you take the US example, it is true that there are alumni preferences in admissions to American universities, which is a scandal. And it's even true that if you're rich enough, you can buy a place for your children. And those facts contribute to the ability of rich people to get their kids into prestigious universities. On the other hand, if you look across the United States in a typical recent year and ask how many children were there, one of whose parents had a postgraduate degree, whose scores on the college admissions test, the SAT, hit the Ivy League median, the answer is 15,000 roughly. And now if you ask how many children, neither of whose parents graduated high school, had scores that hit the Ivy League median, well, the tail becomes so thin that statistics become unreliable. But if you grind out the statistics, the answer is 32. And what that shows you is that while there is a real nepotism problem, even without the nepotism, if you just look at the so-called merits, namely who can do well on tests, it turns out that the children of rich and well-educated parents do much, much better on tests than everybody else. And some of the slides I show will give you some of the data that explain why this should happen.
All right. Well, do you want to, actually, you said that you had an example from the world of work too. Do you want to just?
Well, sure. I mean, a simple example from the world of work is, I don't know how many people who are listening are lawyers, but one of the things that's happened in law, particularly in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom, is that the degrees of freedom in drafting legal arrangements have been dramatically increased by various forms of deregulation. And what this means is that clients value increments of legal skill in their lawyers all the way up the skill distribution. So if you have a better lawyer, you'll get a better outcome all the way. If you have a good lawyer, you'll do better than an okay lawyer. If you have a superstar lawyer, you'll do better than with just a good lawyer. And if you have David Boies, a super duper star lawyer, you'll do even better. That's because the technology of producing law has become very sensitive to skill. In a country like Germany, in which there's relatively little freedom to manipulate contract terms or lawsuits, as soon as a lawyer is competent, she produces almost all the value for the client that there is to be had. And so that's a system of legal production that favors mid-skilled competent lawyers over super duper lawyers. And that pattern of transformation has happened particularly in the Anglo-US world throughout all sectors of the economy.
Well, Daniel, will you, I'm holding everyone back because as you may see, there's a waterfall of people making comments, and I want to bring a host of them in about 5-10 minutes, but I just want you to go through, if you would, some of those slides, because there's one thing to make the argument about meritocracy, there's another just to see what the outcomes are. I think the slides will help us do that, and then I'm going to bring in a host of people.
I'll be quick, and I won't say everything that there is to say about the slides, but just so people can get a sense. So this is a familiar slide. This just shows you that the rich are getting much, much richer compared to everybody else across countries. You can see the USA and Germany and the UK, but also South Africa, where you get, since 1975, the share of income captured by the richest has exploded. The question is why this has happened. And here, really, the distinction between aristocrats and meritocrats is important. Aristocrats were born. All you had to do to become the next generation of the aristocracy was for your parents to die. Meritocrats, by contrast, have to be made. That is to say, meritocrats have to transmit privilege and rebuild it afresh in each generation. And initially, what this did is it opened up the elite. So at my own university, Yale, for the first years of meritocracy, what happened is the students got much, much better, and they came from a much wider variety of backgrounds. But since the early to mid 1970s, meritocracy has instead been entrenching privilege. And we can see how this works just by looking at some basic facts. The first thing is that today, elites marry each other. So the share of people with college degrees who marry other people with college degrees, we should advance the slide. I'm unable to advance the slides myself, I'm afraid.
Sam will do that for you. There you go.
Yeah. As you can see, the share of couples in which both partners possess a college degree has increased 8-fold in the US since the 1960s. And
wow.
Almost nobody with a college degree marries somebody without a college degree. It's also the case that in the US, and this is also true in the UK, educated, wealthy people stay married, have children inside of marriage, and raise their children in intact marriages. Whereas working and middle-class people don't so much anymore. That's another massive advantage that the children of the rich get. Of course, the effects on schooling are much, much greater still. This is an astonishing fact. The average US public school spends about $12,000 per pupil per year, but the most elite 20 private schools in the US spend about $75,000 per pupil per year on educating their children. That ratio is not 6-to-1, it's about 4-to-1 between
and is that a misplaced investment or
mostly it is not. So what it used to be that these were misplaced investments, that the posh schools invested in fun and the outside signals of status. But now what they do is they deploy the most recent educational psychology to figure out how to get the most learning into their kids as efficiently as possible. And you'll see it's not misplaced if you look at the next slides. They produce massive differences in childhood achievement. This is the blue line is the rich middle class income achievement gap in the United States over time. And the red line is the middle class poor gap. And as you can see, as the middle class and the poor have been slowly converging, the elite has been leaving the middle class behind.
Right.
And if you want to get a sense, these are the same ratios in income, and you can see how the graphs parallel each other extremely closely. These are not small effects, they're large effects. The dashed blue line is the white-black gap, and the red line is the rich-poor gap in achievement for students. And as you can see, by 2000, the rich have come to out-achieve the poor in the United States by more than white Americans out-achieved Black Americans in 1954. 1954 was the year Brown against Board of Education was decided. So economic inequality now in the United States produces as great a difference in children's academic achievement as apartheid did at mid-century. That's the extent of this effect. And the principal effect is, again, between the rich and the middle class.
Hold on, Daniel, can I just interrupt you at this stage? Just because while you were talking, there's been a debate about the intersection between economics and race in particular, and whether or not that meritocracy has long disadvantaged people of color, whether or not that's long been the case. I just wanted to bring in someone who made that point, because Yasmin, if you're there, Yasmin Abdul Majid, are you there? Because you made that point, I think, in the chat, and I just think, given that it just came up here, it'd be worth picking up on.
Yeah, thanks, Craig.
Yeah.
I appreciate all the sort of context and the stats that you're putting forward, Daniel, but I'm curious because I think as, you know, a Black Muslim migrant woman, the conversation around meritocracy has been one that activists in the Black community have been talking about for a long time, that feminists have been talking about for a long time. The myth of meritocracy is one that I think, you know, anyone who's engaged in social justice has talked about. And I'm curious as to A, how much of a racialized and gendered take you have looked at through your work, but also why you think that you are the right messenger maybe for everyone to hear this.
Yeah, so on the second point, on the messenger, here's what I have to say, which may not be a satisfactory answer. There are a lot of ways in which I can't possibly be the right messenger, since I am myself the beneficiary and the product of all the systems that I'm describing. No part of the argument of this book is a testimonial either to my experience or to my virtue. Instead, what the book does is it lays out a series of facts and a series of arguments connecting these facts. And the question for the reader is, do you find it persuasive or not? And as much as possible, I want to remove myself as messenger, except insofar as necessary to identify that I am in a conflicted position. And you should discount what I say accordingly, as you think right. Now, on the other 2 points, on gender and race, I think the story is quite different with respect to gender and with respect to race. On gender, there's this extremely powerful consequence of this problem, which is that if the rich are rich based on the training of children, and in particular based on what economists call human capital, that means that parents are principal production workers in the economy, because what they're producing is the human capital for the next generation. And it turns out that in order to raise a meritocratic child, you have to make massive investments, not just of money, but also of personal time and effort in the human capital of the next generation. And in a world in which pre-existing gender roles are patriarchal, and so bias the pressure to produce this labor onto women, what you get is elite meritocratic women who leave the labor force when they have children in order to create the next generation of meritocrats. And you see this all over. So, you know, in elite US American law schools, the industry I know best, half of the students are women. In the first year associate classes of the highest paid law firms, half of the associates are women. Fewer than 1 in 10 partners is a woman. And that's driven by the combination of the pressures of meritocratic parenting and the pressures of patriarchy. So there's a real gender issue. Now, with respect to race, I know the data for the United States, and I think it's incredible.
I think we're just having a
I've just lost sound. Daniel, we just lost your sound for a second.
So
There you are.
there's,
Daniel, sorry to interrupt.
I lost my sound.
We lost your second sound. So start the point on race again, if you would.
Okay. On race, can you hear me again?
Yeah, we got you again.
Okay, so it's very complicated. And I think there are at least three things that are going on. On the one hand, meritocracy has been used flat out, barefacedly, as a tool of racial discrimination. So for example, there is internal archival material from, say, the University of Texas, in which university officials asked themselves in the 60s, how can we use the SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude Test entrance exam, threshold most effectively to exclude African-American students from the University of Texas? So they set their response to admissions tests in order to exclude Black Americans from the university. So there's that version of this. Another version of this, which is not explicit intentional racism, but is structural racism, is that under circumstances of structural inequality, things that distend inequality will damage people who are at the bottom of the structural inequality. So
I think we lost you again briefly. Yasmin, can you hear Daniel? All right. I'm hoping Daniel's going to come.
Effects of meritocracy. Are you back?
We got you back. But we lost you just at the end.
So one thing that's happened is that the white-black income and wealth gap in the United States has not shrunk.
Mm-hmm.
And that's significantly because of the interaction between meritocracy and inequality.
Right.
But a third point, which is the thing that makes it really complicated, is that because talent is not the property of any one group, it's also true that meritocracy has helped to produce a genuine elite from previously excluded groups.
But and Dan, can I just ask you one thing? Just I suppose that picks up on Yasmin's point right at the beginning, of the point about the messenger that you picked up first, is that one of the things I think I've heard you say before is that if you'd read Thomas Piketty's book, and if you and I'm going to give it a very sort of bastardized précis, which is capitalism is in trouble because people who have the capital can make more money than those without, right? That critique of capitalism actually works quite nicely for people like you and me, in that we can blame central bankers or the financial system. Whereas, to be fair to Yasmin in terms of the point, the reason why this book is difficult is actually it points the finger directly at you and me. You know, the system that we are the beneficiaries of is the system that excludes others, even though it's the system that previously we prided ourselves on.
Yeah, I think it is certainly the case that the natural audience for the Piketty story, and just to be clear to everyone who's listening, the central feature of Piketty's story is that the driver of inequality is not labor, it's capital. And inequality is driven not by the 1%, but by the 0.00001%.
Mm-hmm.
That central story absolves elite journalists, university professors, civil servants, public intellectuals of really any responsibility for the inequality that we are suffering now. Whereas the story I'm telling, which focuses on elite schools, elite universities, and elite labor income, places us at the center of the problem.
So can I, I'm going to invite, I see William Jeremy's hands up, I'm going to come to him in a moment, because he's raised in the chat, Daniel, the Michael Young book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, which I want to come to in a moment. But Dan McKee has asked a question. I'd like to bring Dan in because this is one of the key questions, which is then why has meritocracy had such a hold on us? Dan, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems I've always had with meritocracy as a concept is that it sounds like this lovely thing, and anything that sounds too good to be true usually is. And if you look at our entire sort of social structure, political system, economic system, we live in a system built on so many inequalities, fundamentally, structurally so, designed so that there are certain people on top and people who are being exploited, people who are not getting what they need, so that people who have power, elite, etc., can get more than they need, etc. We live in that sort of system, and I've always felt, and I think this seems to bear this out, that the concept of meritocracy basically plays a propaganda purpose in this society to ensure that we feel it's all fair, that there are inequalities, there are some people with more, some people with less, but we've all tried and we've all had this fair playing field. And I guess in some way it's their fault that as an individual that something has gone wrong and made sure that they didn't have the things that maybe they need. It's not the whole system's problem. It's not set up specifically so that is the case. And I think what you're talking about is sort of exposing something that I guess people who have been looking at the system on a whole would say is a problem with it, that the meritocracy is a myth, and it's a useful myth that has been used explicitly to maintain a broken political and economic system.
Yeah, so I think I have two responses to that. The first is that one of the reasons meritocracy has such charisma actually goes, it can be put in terms of something Marx said about capitalism, which people on the left don't emphasize enough, which is that capitalism for Marx was the system that would undo feudalism. So although it had its own forms of exploitation and alienation, he didn't speak about injustice because justice is a bourgeois concept, but it had its own demerits. One of its merits was that it undid feudalism. And similarly, meritocracy, for all its demerits, has the merit that it has undermined aristocracy. And it got a lot of good press in the UK, but also in the US between the end of the Second World War and the mid-1970s, because these were societies that were still dominated by basically hereditary breeding-based elites who ran all the big firms, took all the places at the poshest schools, dominated government, and had the feature that they weren't particularly hardworking and they were pretty dumb. And when you started letting people get ahead based on their own accomplishments, this shoved that elite aside. And that was a salutary development. And it worked as advertised. And in that way, it was a good thing. And even today, just to give you an example, the managing partner of Cravath, Swaine and Moore, which is maybe the poshest law firm in New York now, is a Muslim woman who is the child of Pakistani immigrants. That's not possible in America without meritocracy.
So then you're jumping inevitably to the question that must be on the top of everyone's mind, which is, so what do you do if you have a system that has the capacity to transform individual lives, but en masse entrenches inequality?
Right. I think that's the deep question, and the answer is not to go back to aristocracy, right? That's right. For sure. And the answer also is not to give up on the idea that accomplishment is worthwhile and that people should develop skills. Since finishing the book, I've started thinking about a distinction between what we might want to call excellence and what we might want to call superiority. Now, so excellence is different from superiority in two ways. First, excellence is a threshold concept, not a rank concept. Mm-hmm. So if I'm excellent at something, the fact that you're better at it no longer doesn't make.
Oh, Daniel, we're going to lose you. We have a gift for losing you just at these critical moments. I'm sorry about that. Daniel.
Yep, I'm back.
Oh, there you are. It's a real tease. It's like someone. It's like It's like you're just about to put the ball in the goal.
I'm sorry about this. I don't know what. So I was going to say the second thing is that excellence is a substantive concept. Right. I have to be good at something worth doing.
Right.
For me to be excellent. Superiority is different in both respects. It's a rank concept. No matter how good I am, if you're better than I am, I'm no longer superior. And I can be superior at something even if it's a venal or vicious activity.
Yeah.
And our form of meritocracy worships superiority.
So you're,
rather than excellence.
so can you explain that in a practical term? Then you're saying.
So here's a very concrete example. Think about commercial life, running a firm, running a business. One way to think about commercial life is that the business produces a good or provides a service. And it does this in an excellent way if it produces a good or provides a valuable service. And profit is a side effect of running the business well. Okay?
Yes.
Now, in a financialized economy, those things become literally nonsense. Because in a financialized economy, the only thing people aim at is profit. The idea of there being something that the business does other than making a profit is, from the perspective of the financial markets, just nonsense.
Right.
And the only thing they aim at is more profit than others, since after all, even especially for the rich, money is a purely competitive good. They all have more money than they need. The only thing they need is more money than others. So you replace excellence with superiority. And this produces a series of distortions in how people run their firms, what products they make, how the economy is structured, and the inner lives of the elite. And the trick is to return to an idea of excellence in which we have a conception of what's worth doing and how it needs to be done in order to be worth doing.
All right. So well, I'm going to come back to that, because I can see there's a link between financialization and this point about superiority and excellence. I want to bring in, there are a couple of people who've got their hands up. I'd love to bring them in. William Jeremy, I asked you to come in actually, because William, you made the point about the rise of the meritocracy. And William, will you just say your impressions of that Michael Young book and what you think it means vis-a-vis what Daniel's written?
Yes. What's extraordinary, Dan, about what you've written is that it is a vindication of what Michael Young, who was a British intellectual in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, right the way through to the 90s. Michael Young wrote the Labour Party manifesto of 1945, which ushered in Clement Attlee's government post-war, which changed Britain and the world. But he wrote in 1958 this satire called The Rise of the Meritocracy, which, it seems to me, you have shown what he was worried about has come true. The big thing in the 40s and 50s was society was going to be transformed through public education, particularly. And there was a huge debate about the extension of the grammar school system and also the extension of the university system. In the early 60s, was the Robbins Report in the early 60s, James? The Robbins Report was a report that led to the expansion of what we now call the red brick universities. Yeah. And that allowed a lot more of the middle class to the expanded middle class that we'd seen in the 40s and 50s to benefit from a higher education.
So Dan,
but he wrote it very much as a satire.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you have demonstrated that has his fears and his worries have come true. And
yes,
that's extraordinary.
Yeah, I should say I spent some time at the end of the book talking about Michael Young and the rise of the meritocracy.
Excellent.
And I think there are two differences. I think you're right that he was prescient, and it's saying that up to the end of his life he was dismayed that people glommed onto meritocracy as a term of praise. The two differences, I think, is that in his satire, he took the nature side of the nature-nurture divide. And he imagined that the way in which meritocracy would work was almost like sort of Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, that there would be more and more accurate intelligence testing earlier and earlier in an infant's life. And people would be sorted based on their natural capacity. And I think what's actually happened is almost the reverse of that, which is that it turns out nurture dominates.
Right.
Elite spend so much energy and money educating their children that native ability plays a very small role in who gets ahead. It's this incredibly intensive system of training. That's one big difference. The other thing which I think is important, and it's politically important, although it's also politically, it's been controversial in the book, is this claim that the system we have doesn't serve the elite well. So that, you know, if you're rich because you've inherited land, your wealth frees you because you can mix your land with other people's labor, extract profit or rent, and do whatever you want. But if you're rich because of your own training, your own human capital, the only way in which to extract income from your wealth is by mixing it with your own labor. And that means you have to exploit yourself. And you have to exploit yourself ruthlessly. And so again, in a technical, classical, scientific, socialist, Marxist sense, what's happened is that meritocracy has pushed Marx's diagnosis of labor up the class structure. The middle class has become the Lumpenproletariat, without enough work, blocked by class consciousness from coming to a realization, blocked by ideology from coming to a realization of its class position. And exploited and alienated labor has come home to roost in the elite.
And just on that, Daniel, I just want to make a point though, because one of the things that sort of, if you like, there are two sort of pivotal ideas in the book about meritocracy. One is that it's very bad for the middle class, but the other is that it's very bad for the elite too. And I love, there's a very simple thing you say about what elites say to each other: how are you? I'm so busy. Right? And part of your point in the book is this is disastrous for the way you live if you're in the elite.
Yes, and maybe if Sam, if you can show slides and go to maybe the next to last slide. Let's see if that's the right one.
Okay, it'd be great.
Let's see if it can be pulled up. This is a slide that's one before that, and then we'll look at that one also. So this is average weekly hours worked in the United States by income rank over the past 70 years or so. And as you can see, the bottom 60% of the distribution, so this is most people, are working materially fewer hours a week than they used to. And this data underestimates the effect because it doesn't take into account differential unemployment. And it doesn't take into account labor force participation. This is just for people who work full time. And then each additional slice of the elite is working longer and longer hours. And so one effect of this is to shift the labor burden up. The elite is working too hard, and the red line is not people who don't want to work. It's people who can't get work because the economy is learning to do without them.
And the purple line, that 1%,
right,
have that's the increase. They weren't working much, and now they're working more than anyone.
Now they're working more and more and more. Exactly right. If you go to the next slide, here's another thing that this does. This is an absolutely shocking slide. So the Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality across the whole distribution. The black line is the Gini for the full US distribution. The blue line is the Gini within the top 5%, created by ignoring the bottom 95% of the distribution. And in recent years, there's been more inequality within the richest 20th of Americans than in society as a whole.
Sorry, it's the top five, as in the top 20% of Americans.
The top 20th, the richest 5%.
Wow.
So there's more inequality inside the richest 20th than there is in society as a whole. And what that means is that inequality has taken on a kind of a fractal character. As you get inside each additional elite, there's more inequality than there was before. And so everybody is constantly at risk of being expelled from their reference group.
And everybody, and also
nobody is secure.
And to be non-technical about it, everyone's working hard and everyone's pissed off. Because everyone thinks that they're getting.
Because everyone thinks everybody else is getting ahead.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Now, again, you know, someone just said, I actually feel for these elites in the chat. And I want to be clear. I actually, you know, I'm not quite a member of this group, but I'm adjacent to them. I don't necessarily feel for them politically, in the sense that I don't think that this fact gives the middle class a reason to be generous.
Right.
But what's really important about this is that existentially, this is a terrible position to be in. And it means that if we could undo the system, it would be better for everybody.
Right. Well, I'm aware of time, but I'm also really aware of people who wanted to weigh in. I want to bring in, if I might, Daniel. I can see that Gary Izunwa has put his hand up. Gary, you've had your hand up for a while, and I'm going to bring in a couple of other people, if I might, too.
Sure. Can you hear me? Just want to double check.
Yeah, fine.
Brilliant. So I work at the British Council in Beijing, where I manage social mobility programs, or programs for our flagship social mobility campaign. So I'm instinctively very interested in this stuff. And I think the challenge I have with some of the themes in the book is that it almost assumes that by democratizing elite education, then social mobility will happen, and then, you know, people from lower income backgrounds will do well. But we know that education is not the panacea for inequality, because in this country, that is the UK, someone or a working class person born in the bottom 20% of incomes, even when they get a degree, they are still likely to earn less than a middle class person without a degree, right? A working class person in this country, when they go to university and get a first class degree, they are still less likely to enter an elite occupation than a middle class individual with a 2-2. And even when that middle class or working class person does get into an elite occupation, they earn 16% less than a middle class person that also enters that. So there is something that education cannot solve for in the conversation of inequality. And when I talk about social mobility, I see it through a very Bourdieusian lens. So following the work of the late Pierre Bourdieu, French sociologist, because he asserts that it is the social privileges of the ruling class that allows the ruling class to avail opportunities, right? And not just the stocks of education. So I think that the conversation of inequality and social mobility has been dominated by education so much that inequalities of social capital and cultural capital have been so underserved, and we've been fooled by the elite's education to a degree that the conversation about how we democratize social networks and capital isn't really spoken about. So I'd love to understand a bit more about, from your perspective, Daniel, even in the presence of elite education from those who come from the bottom quintile of incomes or working class, how do you still explain inequality then?
Yeah, so Sam, could you show slide 20 and go forward from there? There's a point, Gary, at which we're going to agree, and there's a point at which we might disagree. We agree that education is not the solution. In fact, it's more nearly the problem. So this is data in the US on the odds of going to a college as a function of your parents' income rank. And as you can see, the rich all go to college, the poor virtually never do. It's hard to find something more distressing than this, but show the next slide, Sam. This is the quality of the college you go to by your parents' income rank, which is even more steep. And now if you show the next few slides, the rich are overrepresented by a factor of 14-to-1 compared to the poor at America's elite colleges. And at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, if you show the next slide, and Stanford, there are more students from the top 1% of the income distribution than from the entire bottom 60%. Okay, so that's the degree to which elite education has become a rich person's game. Now, the question that you raise, Gary, which I think is a really difficult one, and I don't think there's an empirical way to distinguish these or separate these with full confidence, is whether what's going on is that when these graduates get such high income, it's because their training gives them certain skills that are incredibly valuable and therefore they dominate income, or it's because their social networks and social capital is so high.
Gary, do you want to come back on that? Oh, someone's muted Gary.
Sorry, I muted myself. I'm muted now. I understand that, and I think, let's say in a perfect world, let's say we do democratize the education and everyone is going to Oxford and Cambridge or an Ivy League and they're getting into these great universities. When we don't talk about the importance of social capital and cultural capital and information dissemination, if we do educate everybody and they get to these, they have these elite credentials, but they still can't enter certain occupations because of the lack of understanding of how to build relationship with an interviewer who's probably often middle upper class, not having the right networks to connect you with someone. We're going to have a really depressed group of really educated people. So, which you mentioned also in your book as well. So I think, again, my issue with this conversation with education is that it doesn't account for the inequalities in social capital and cultural capital, because there's no point talking about it so much if we get to a point where everyone is educated and everyone's so well, but no one is achieving their potential. I think what a challenge, sorry, Daniel, is a challenge with meritocracy is, well, I don't have an issue with meritocracy in itself as a definition. What I think meritocracy has come to lack is contextualization. We're not looking at people in the context of which they have achieved their outcomes, be it 3 A's at A level or whatever it is, or a very high GPA maybe for you, Daniel. We just look at grades and credentials as they are and then assess them quite rigidly. I think if we can, the better we can get at contextualized assessment, be it for getting into university, school, or employment, the better we may have with admitting people from different backgrounds. But if we're just going to look at education as a panacea for inequality in society, we're not going to get, I personally don't think we're going to develop more.
No, on that point, we agree entirely.
Yeah,
which is to say, education is not the solution. Certainly not hierarchical education. The thing I would favor is much less elite education for anybody and much more democratic education.
So Daniel,
just one thing, what role social capital plays independently? I think we probably agree it plays a significant role.
Absolutely, but it's not spoken about enough. That is my issue, is that it plays so much. I know many people that have gone on to the LSEs, the UCLs, and so forth, gotten good degrees, and then when they graduate, it's not for a lack of ambition from wanting to go to be a banker or a lawyer. They can't get those jobs because they don't know how to, and then they go and work in retail or something, right? Which is not commensurate with the degree that they have achieved. So we have these depressed class of people that have been told by the system that if you study and if you get good grades, you will achieve. But that's not. That's
Can
just
I
false.
say one story about this?
It's a pipe dream.
So one thing, for example, and this is really complicated. It's ethically complicated also. Yale Law School now, for example, has a student group called First Generation Professionals, which is an affinity group for students whose parents are not themselves college or professional school graduates. And one of the things this group does is it builds up the social capital of its members. So for example, it has a wine tasting society with a law school provided budget to buy and taste wines so that its students can then be comfortable in the social settings to which they might arrive. Now, it's really complicated whether that's a good idea or not, actually. Because on the one hand, it benefits these students by giving them social capital of the sort, Gary, I think you rightly say they need. On the other hand, what it does is it transforms people into members of this social elite.
Yeah.
In a way which is not good socially and also personally insulting to the students, who, after all, shouldn't need to know about claret in order to work as lawyers.
So Daniel, this is, I wish we had more time for this, which is for, if you like, the last third of the book, which is, let's just say, I mean, actually listening to you and Gary, what's overwhelmingly clear is you both sort of passionately agree on this problem with the education system. It's now replicated itself in the systems of work, and its unfairness is just obvious from every slide, everything you said. And practically, what do you do about that? And it struck me, we're talking about big practical things. What do you do about private education? What do you do about selection? What do you do about, as Gary said, contextualized recruitment? Are there behavioral things, incremental things you can do that will change this? Or is there something revolutionary and fundamental you need to do to change this?
So I think there are incremental things, but I think about this along two dimensions. The first is politics, and the second is policy.
Mm-hmm.
The politics is to build a coalition that will push for change, and then pursue policies that have the property that when they get enacted, they strengthen the coalition behind them, mm-hmm. rather than producing backlash. So this is this is something that equality movements are getting increasingly sophisticated about. How to build coalitions and then how to win in a way that makes you stronger, rather than a way that enrages your opponents. In terms of policies, one policy that's particularly important in both the UK and the US is that private education, elite private education in its current form, is simply unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's enormously privileged. So, in the UK, private schools are exempted from VAT. In the US, private schools and colleges are treated as charities and so exempted from income tax, and alumni donations are tax deductible. Princeton's tax-exempt status, Princeton University's tax-exempt status, amounted to a public subsidy of $100,000 per pupil per year. Even as more students at Princeton come from the richest 1% than from the bottom 3/5.
And why would you not, Daniel, why would you not just ban private education rather than change the tax arrangements around it?
Well, this has to do with the first political point, which is to say, in societies that have the division between public and private that both the UK and the US have, both in their constitutional law and in their ideology, banning private associations for educational purposes is very hard to do. Mm-hmm. Hard to make constitutional and will generate enormous political opposition. But pointing out that these institutions at present function as private clubs and shouldn't get the public subsidies that a charity gets, and pointing out that they're wealthy enough that they could double their enrollments and take most of the new students from the working and middle classes, means that now you have a situation in which this reform could be widely popular.
Right.
It would even benefit the elite by making admissions competition less stressful and eliminating or alleviating some of the difficulties that we discussed earlier. So now you have a coalition that could favor this in its own interest as well as in the interest of justice. Mm-hmm. And if the reform succeeded, these institutions would become both more inclined to favor.
Have we just lost you for the, very briefly, I hope for the last time? Daniel, are you with us? I'm hoping you're going to come back. There you are, you are back. Yes, sorry. My colleague Tess Morris says it's seance.
That's generous.
Well, listen, on that point, let me ask you to end on this point. You're a professor of law at Yale Law School. I mean, in its sense, it's a kind of, you're a living example of the system, but you're also within the system. And I just wonder, when you walk across campus, do your fellow professors who've got tenure there think, oh, wow, there goes the guy who wants to have a go at meritocracy in the system of education? Or do they say, yeah, he's right, we should strip away our tax status and we should double our enrollment? What's the attitude within the institution?
Well, the main attitude to anybody who has any ideas is that people ignore you. So that's the baseline attitude. Insofar as people don't ignore you, I think in the US, the elite is beginning to realize that the current system is untenable, and that the effort to sustain or hoard status and wealth is becoming damaging to those who have it, and that the basic commitments of a university to education and to research and the development of ideas would be better served if we became a little less elite. And so it's some people have politics or whatever, but enlightened self-interest is that this system is not good even for those institutions that seem to be doing well. And so there's some openness, I think.
Well, Dan, that is an encouraging and hopeful note on which to end. I have to confess that although your Wi-Fi has been a little occasional, I feel as though I've done a lousy job this evening in that there are so many people who wanted to weigh in, have comments and points. But there's a reason for that, which is that I do think this is a book that for some people, this is a sort of statement of the obvious. It's something they've seen for a long time. For others, it's a really profound challenge to the system that we live in. The funny thing is both of those things can be true. And personally, I do think it forces us to think very fundamentally about our system of education and very fundamentally about the patterns and behaviors and systems at work. And I'm enormously grateful to you to share the hour to talk about it with us. I think that the themes in it are going to be really interesting. And I hope that at some point we can come back and explore some of those in more detail, particularly around excellence and superiority. It's a big thing to think about. And I hope that, you know, for Tortoise members, they'll get a chance to read the Meritocracy Trap or exchange some of those ideas. We'll certainly keep working away at them. We can't do what we would do if you were in London, which is take you to the pub and thank you. But these days we could barely do that anyway. So all we can do is wave at you and say thank you very much, Daniel Markovits. Thanks everyone for joining this evening. Hope you have a very good evening.